To what extent was the First World War a key factor in America's return to its isolationist policies? So again, an essay where one is going to have to discuss the relative importance of World War I, whilst at the same time bringing to your essay and your planning other contributing factors. Throughout the essay, you will be expected to quantify those additional factors and also compare them against the significance of World War I. The United States' return to isolationist policies or normalcy at the end of World War I was, in my opinion, the end of the briefest change in US policy. So alluding here to the significance not being particularly significant. Founded on isolationist belief, she only entered the war for pragmatic reasons in 1917, and her telling contribution led to victory in 1918. Victory achieved, however, the US, given the choice between Wilson's internationalism and Harding's normalcy, the US readily embraced the latter. I believe that the war was simply the tipping point, so again quantifying its significance, and that long and short-term considerations, so added extra depth of analysis, based upon white Anglo-Saxon Protestant reaction to perceived political and social change, or as we teach it in the course, the rebellion, the changes to American society, was more important. World War I was an economic triumph for the US, which allowed them to maintain its isolationist stance from European affairs, whilst taking advantage of its economic advantage of the distraction of its principal economic rivals. Traditional laissez-faire politics had resulted in economic involvement becoming too pressing a reason for the US not to join. Although I believe that this involvement in a globalized economy was one that the US never really left behind, the realization that the US was involved contributed to a resurgence in a return to isolationism. I do not feel, however, that the US would ever truly be able to become the isolated country it had before. So the analytical focus towards the end. Most importantly, the return to isolationism was more to do with long-term social and political pressures. Remember, these terms were introduced in the introduction, brought about by the near-revolutionary changes being experienced by the United States in the first decades of the 20th century. So we're taking the question back beyond the title. We're reducing the significance of World War I. Most importantly, the return to isolation was more to do with the long-term social and political pressures brought about by the near-revolutionary changes experienced by the US in the first decades of the 20th century. The traditional WASP elite of the US were increasingly sensing that their traditional deeply conservative values were being challenged by forces associated with mass migration, additional locations, new political ideas, technological innovation, and industrialization. So these are the other factors that need to be considered. With these challenges or rebellions came the reactionary responses of the WASPs. The rebellions that forced the WASP elite to react and subsequently return the USA to isolationism included the rise of a non-Protestant and white immigration, the increased consumption of alcohol, and the rapid urbanization of the country brought about by unregulated immigration. So we are talking about other factors and attempting to quantify them in relation to World War I. The open door policy had already started being tweaked with in order to prefer immigration from Europe before World War I, acknowledging the long-term issues prior to World War I, again trying to quantify the significance of World War I vis-à-vis these other things. Immigration additionally brought with it the cultural changes that, like alcohol, which challenged the traditional dry sobriety of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America, and political changes like the rise of communism brought to the USA from Eastern Europe in the wake of the 1917 Russian Revolution and the end of World War I. All of these were dynamic forces in America prior to the end of World War I, which, though somewhat overlooked whilst the war was being fought, both directly and indirectly, nonetheless were apparent in American society. So once again, we bring the question back to comparing the significance of these new introduced factors we've got here with World War I and its role, quantifying and analysing. In 1917, with the USA's decision to enter the war, the country fought the war to a successful conclusion. Yet in the reflection that followed the war, the United States reached a juncture whereby they could choose to either fully embrace internationalism or revert to their old ways. Despite the prosperity that the war had brought, the United States, the human cost had been great, and the economic dislocation that followed brought both political and social unrest. Returning soldiers found their jobs taken by women and black Americans, and strikes led to a rise in political tension in the form of the first Red Scare. This was fertile soil for the Republican presidential nominee Harding to sow the seeds of return to isolationism or normalcy. So again, taking other factors and explaining how, although linked to World War I, they were not solely the responsibility of World War I. Newly found wealth and prosperity, disappointment at the direct involvement in the war, and a fear of change in the world manifested in the fall of traditional empires, and the rise of communism convinced the US electorate to return to their traditional values and re-engage with the concerns that emerged prior to the outbreak of World War I. So the long-term causes predate the war. Harding's normalcy would be the green light to challenging the rebellions of the first 2 decades of the 20th century and reacting in order to re-establish traditional American values. The war was ultimately the tipping point in changing America's course. So the war is significant, but not the key point. The war is significant in itself, but only serving as to focus the US on issues that have been apparent for the whole country, not just 1914 to 18.